talk about what happens in Japan. It's really important for us to realize that the experience of Japan is really unique compared to the Ottomans and the Chinese in the sense that they were able to modernize really quickly. They do so in less than half a century. And they start to become a competing imperial power with the US and with Western Europe by the end of the 19th century. Compare that to the Qing dynasty, which collapses and establishes a republic that continues to be bullied by countries like Japan, as well as European powers. And they're really going to suffer by the World War II era. And also compare that to the Ottoman Empire, which ceases to exist and breaks up into the modern city-states, like Turkey and the Balkan states, right? So Japan, like China, it was attempting to preserve its isolationist stance, and it was able to successfully do so for over 200 years. So from 1600 to 1854, the Japanese were largely isolated. You might remember that during the early period of the Tokugawa Shogunate, there was some contact between the Japanese and foreigners. This started with the presence of missionaries and also merchants. You are going to have a period of conversions of the Japanese to Christianity, like the Chinese. But eventually, you're going to have a major resistance to this foreign influence. So eventually, the shogun's actually going to essentially ban all foreigners from Japan with the closed country edicts. So one of the reasons why they do that is because Japanese leaders were really afraid of the effect that Europeans were having on other places, so like Java, Malaysia, and China. So they respond by closing themselves off. They stop almost all trade with foreigners, and they also close foreign embassies. Japanese soldiers were ordered to kill any foreign sailors who washed up on Japanese soil, and the Japanese military was also required to sink any ships that came near their ports. Okay, the only exception to that was that there was a limited presence. There was just one little area on the island of Nagasaki. It was open to the Dutch East India Company, but they were only allowed to live there. They were kept in almost total seclusion. You are going to have the traders there introduce some Western ideas about shipbuilding and medicine that start to make their way into the Japanese culture, but other than that, the influence of foreigners in Japan is very limited. So basically, you're going to have, like China, a long-standing period of isolationism. The Japanese are also going to have some limited trade with the Chinese during this period, but that's really different from this, trade with European powers. So in the early years, the Japanese were able to successfully ward off foreigners. But by the mid-19th century, this changes, and this changes because of a U.S. military presence, which essentially intimidates the Japanese government to yield. So in 1853, a U.S. Commodore named Matthew Perry arrives in Japan for the first time. He meets with the government, and he requests trade privileges. So he's in Tokyo actually meeting with the government. And at first, the government refuses to grant the U.S. trade privileges. So Matthew Perry leaves. But then he comes back the next year with even more ships. And again, he demands that the U.S. That Japan is going to engage with the U.S. In a trade relationship. So basically, the Japanese are intimidated by the power of U.S. warships since their navy was growing stronger. So the Japanese give in to the U.S. demands, and then later, European countries are going to want to do the same. So after the Japanese open to the U.S. by 1854, other countries in Europe are going to follow. So you're going to have trade privileges open up to Britain, the Netherlands, and Russia much more. So the implication is that Matthew Perry opened Japan to the West. So basically, Japan's strategy, they were trying to open themselves to exploring Western technology, but they also wanted to avoid sort of getting rid of their traditions, right? They wanted to maintain most of their social customs, including a traditional family structure. They also were really trying to avoid the kinds of interference that the Chinese and Ottomans were experiencing from the Europeans. So they didn't want the capitulation trade relationship, and they also didn't want to have a foreign power go to war with them to force them to open trade, like what happened with the Opium Wars in China. So Japan is actually going to rapidly modernize because of this opening, but again, they maintain a lot of their social customs. All right, and then what follows is that the shogunate, which was the system of government that had been in place since the 12th century, is going to collapse. So if you remember, in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate, the emperor existed, but he was just a figurehead. He normally spent most of his time away from the government, and the actual ruler was a shogun, who was a powerful military leader. Japan was also a feudal society at this point. So the shoguns, the military dictators, were unable to govern by the 19th century in the face of the conflict with Europeans and domestic critics. You're going to have increasing local disputes between the daimyos, who were like the lords of different provinces, and foreigners. So two incidents occur in southern Japanese provinces. One happens in Satsuma, where samurai kill two Englishmen because they violated a point of Japanese etiquette. And because of that, the daimyo was asked to pay an indemnity fee to England. But the daimyo resented having to pay because they were very anti-foreign. And so the government had to pay the indemnity to England instead. And then you also have resistance in Choshu, which is another far western and southern province in Japan. And what happens there is that a lord fires upon passing foreign vessels. What you're going to have happen is, again, the European nations are going to fine the lord who does this. And eventually, Choshu and Satsuma in particular start to adopt Western military technology in order to challenge the power of the shogun. And they eventually are going to descend upon the shogun in Edo, or Tokyo. His name was Yoshinobu Tokugawa. You see him over here to the left. And he was forced to abdicate by 1867. All right, and so then the new emperor, who is essentially restored to power, his name was, well, we call him Meiji, but his actual personal name, I don't know why I'm not seeing it right now. There it is. Mutsuhito was his personal name, but he went by Meiji. So basically the restoration of the emperor to power was called the Meiji Restoration. So that ends the Tokugawa shogunate. So very quickly you're going to see the Meiji Restoration is characterized by major reforms in Japan, which is what really distinguishes it from China and the Ottoman Empire. The Emperor Mutsuhito, or Meiji, was on the young side. He was very energetic, and you clearly see right now already that in terms of his dress, he is very willing to be influenced by Westerners, unlike the previous shogun, Yoshinobu Tokugawa, who was, much more traditionally Japanese looking. You're going to have the emperor very quickly try to do away with feudalism. And you are going to see that many daimyos resist, or many of them, actually support his policies, but the ones that do not are actually going to just retire. So basically the emperor is surrounded by people who essentially support his reforms and changes. So he's able to successfully enact many reforms during the Meiji Restoration era. These reforms are characterized by modernization, and this includes the formal abolishment of feudalism. This is done in 1868 by something called the Charter Oath. This gave legal ownership of land to peasants for the first time, and peasants were to pay a fixed annual tax rate. So this brought in some more revenue for the government. And also you're going to have increasing Western approaches towards the justice system. So you're going to have the establishment of equality before the law, and they're also going to abolish cruel and unusual punishment. So you see that Japan is also influenced by Enlightenment ideals. You're going to have the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, and this was based off of the Prussian model, in which the emperor exercised political power and oversaw foreign policy, but there was basically like a parliamentary system that focused on domestic policy. Also, during the Meiji Restoration, you're going to have a remodeling of the military. They also are following the Prussian model here, so they create an army that is similar to them. They build a new navy, and they also institute a conscription or a military draft. And then they also abolish the position of samurai. So this is going to be the only major internal resistance that you have to the Meiji Restoration. They also establish a new postal service, which quickly modernizes the Meiji as well. They're also going to remodel their educational system off of more Western systems. And this is going to result in much higher literacy rates. And then they're also going to heavily promote industrialization. And this is going to be financed internally to a certain extent, and also by some foreign investors. So you're going to have the beginning of a railroad network in Japan in 1869. And the Japanese are actually going to employ British engineers. So you're going to see that there is a foreign influence on their modernization process. You do see that the reforms of the Meiji Restoration were sort of uneven in their effectiveness. So I would say that the greater result of the reforms were in terms of schools. They greatly improved literacy rates, but you are going to see that the political reforms that they enact does not result in an overly strong democracy. Basically, you don't have really strong political parties emerge. So this means that most of the people that take positions of power are army officers. All right, so again, the group that is most opposed to the Meiji Restoration were the samurai, who you could compare to the Janissaries in the sense that they were treated very well in society, and they were a distinguished social elite class. So by 1871, Japan gives the samurai a final lump sum payment, and then they dissolve the position of samurai. So the reason why the samurai were so resistant to this was because they stood out from all other classes, because only the samurai were able to carry swords in public, and the Bushido culture during the Tokugawa shogunate was something that was formally respected by the government. But after they abolished the position of samurai, the Bushido code of conduct was now a personal matter, and it wasn't officially condoned by the government. So there are going to be some samurai who are a little bit more accommodating in this change. So some of them do serve in the government as elder statesmen, but the majority of samurai, particularly the ones from Satsuma and Choshu, which we know were the areas that rebelled against the shogun, are going to be really reluctant to the change. So you're going to see that they try to defend their right to dress and wear their hair in traditional ways, and they want to have relative autonomy from the centralized government. The battles, the resistance from the samurai is going to continue into the late 1870s, and they are eventually going to get put down by the central Japanese government. So again, the samurai are sort of the most resistant to modernizing. Japan, nonetheless, does industrialize and modernize quite a bit. You're going to have the Meiji emperors really want the citizens to be educated and competent, but they also want them to be loyal and obedient to the government. The industrialization was mostly paid for by government financing, and it created a lot of new jobs. So the government provided massive subsidies for training new workers in key industries like tea, silk, weaponry, shipbuilding, and they also start to produce more sake or rice wine. The government also sets up technical schools, and it institutes universal education, which is one of the reasons why literacy rates skyrocket. The central government also modernizes the transportation and communication system, so it establishes new railroads and roads. There's also a high agricultural tax, which finances much of the government investment that created new industries and jobs. So the government's ability to collect increased taxes also provided revenue for the bureaucracy, which was now centered in Tokyo. So what you are going to see is that private investments from overseas are also going to help Japan modernize. And when industries start to flourish, oftentimes they were sold to something called the zaibatsu, which was basically there was an equivalent in other westernized countries. It was essentially a monopoly. So they practiced what was called a vertical integration, which means that they basically owned every element in the supply chain of production. So if they owned an automotive factory, for example, they would own all of the metal parts that were required to build the automobile. They would own the oil production. They would own the glass industry. So essentially, you see with vertical integration, it allows them to monopolize the entire process of creating the final product. One of the other major changes of Japan is that they essentially go from their isolated period to actually fully engaged in the imperialist era. So Japan, since it succeeded in centralizing its government and neutralizing the samurai, and they start to build a conscript army, is going to lead Japan away from that isolation practice and make them much more imperialistic. So Japan starts to follow the pattern that we saw in other newly centralized nations like Germany and Italy. They start to look outward for additional territorial gains, right? Japan was an island, so it was obviously limited in terms of its ability to expand, and its population was growing during this point. So Japan also very largely wanted to just have additional land to settle. They also had a major desire for raw materials, so that's major. There's also going to be an increased sense of nationalism in Japan due to the centralized government. And when Japan defeats China in the Sino-Japanese War, China is forced to give up Formosa, or Thailand, down here. And so you're going to see that begins the major Japanese influence over China, but then eventually also when they defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, they are given a preferential position in Manchuria or Manchukuo. So you're going to see that over time, there's definitely going to be an increased Japanese investment abroad. Also, you're going to see that there are going to be increased workers from Japan that start to branch out and become contract and seasonal workers in places like Hawaii, Guam, and other locations. So this is also going to help Japan gain knowledge of foreign places, which is going to really make them further interested in expanding their presence abroad. They're going to try to establish colonies in Mexico and Latin America, but they're not going to be successful in doing that. So by the early 1900s, they're really looking towards China, Korea, and Russia to areas where it can expand. And they get a major opportunity to do so by 1904 when Japan goes to war with Russia. And this is major because Japan defeats Russia. So this is the first victory of an Asian nation over Europeans in the modern era. And as we know, the Russian Empire was very large. So this is a major defeat for Russia and a major victory for Japan. We also do have an American involvement in this war because the peace treaty, the Treaty of Portsmouth, was drawn up in New Hampshire and was presided over by Teddy Roosevelt. And this gives Teddy Roosevelt a Nobel Prize. And what the treaty does is it gives Japan a preferred position in Manchuria and a protectorate in Korea. So basically now we're going to have Japan start to heavily influence the Korean population. They're going to ban them from speaking Korean. They make them go to Japanese schools. And then increasingly, they're going to increase their influence over Manchuria to the point that they rename it Manchukuo by 1931, and it's also going to essentially be a Japanese colony. And then their presence continues when they invade Nanking shortly before World War II. The war really reveals Russia's weakness and the growing strength of Japan. So Russia falls in the port, in Port Arthur, which is down here. And then after that, they're forced to cede Manchuria to Japan's protection. And also we know that Russia really suffered as a result of the Russo-Japanese War because the Russian Revolution breaks out in 1905 with the peaceful protests in the Winter Palace and the Bloody Sunday response to them. So that's Japan. As you can see, there are definitely major differences between Japan and China and the Ottoman Empire. So that's really what you want to focus on. You want to think about the reasons why Japan was able to successfully modernize and industrialize, whereas China and the Ottoman Empire were not. So that's that. And we'll pick up with our discussions this week. Thanks for watching.